The final days of World War II were marked by desperation and exhaustion, as the reality of defeat began to settle in for many soldiers. Among them were a group of men who had fought on the Eastern Front, far from their homeland, far from everything they had known. They had witnessed horrors that would scar them for life, battles that seemed endless, the incessant bombardment of their positions, and the growing realization that their cause was lost. Now these men, who had been hardened by years of conflict, were faced with a new and unimaginable situation: surrender. The decision was not an easy one, and it weighed heavily on them. They had been soldiers, loyal to their cause, to their country, and now they were nothing more than defeated prisoners of war. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but as the war came to its end, surrender seemed to be the only option left. They had seen their comrades fall around them, and the thought of a heroic last stand had long since faded into the harsh reality of dwindling supplies, mounting casualties, and the relentless advance of the Allied forces. The cold, cruel truth was that they could no longer fight. As the men made their way towards the British lines, their minds were clouded with a mixture of emotions: fear, shame, and an overwhelming sense of loss. They had been taught to view the British soldiers as the enemy, as the oppressors, and now they were at their mercy. Their pride as soldiers had been shattered, and with it, any hope of regaining their honor. There was no glory in surrender, no heroism in yielding to an enemy that had outlasted them. They expected only scorn, humiliation, and cruelty. The stories they had heard of how prisoners were treated by the Allies filled them with dread, and they feared that their fate would be far worse than death. They were hungry, weak, and dirty, their uniforms tattered and stained from the long months of fighting. Their faces were gaunt from starvation, their bodies frail from the lack of proper nourishment. The war had taken everything from them: their health, their youth, their sense of purpose. All that remained was the bitter taste of defeat and the haunting memories of the battlefield. They had seen men torn apart by explosions, watched comrades bleed out in the mud, and felt the fear of knowing that death was always just a step away. Now, it seemed, the only thing left to face was the judgment of those they had once called enemies. When they reached the British lines, they were met with a stern reception. The soldiers who stood guard did not show any sign of warmth or hostility. They were simply doing their job, securing prisoners of war. The men were disarmed and herded into makeshift holding areas, where they were forced to wait. In the meantime, the captors watched them closely, wary of potential escape attempts, but there was no immediate brutality. The men expected harsh interrogations, beatings, or even execution, but none of those came. Instead, there was silence, an unsettling, tense silence that filled the air, leaving them to stew in their own thoughts. As the hours stretched on, they began to feel the gnawing hunger in their stomachs more acutely. It had been days, perhaps even weeks, since they had last had a proper meal. The food rations had long since run out, and all they had to sustain themselves were the scraps they had scavenged during their retreat. Their bodies were hollow, their energy depleted, and every muscle ached from the strain of battle. It was a kind of misery they had grown accustomed to, but it did nothing to ease the shame they felt. To be reduced to this, to be at the mercy of the very soldiers they had once fought against, was a humiliation beyond measure. Then, unexpectedly, there was a shift in the atmosphere. A British officer approached them, his face weary but kind. He was not the image of the ruthless enemy they had anticipated. He did not speak to them in anger or with contempt, but instead addressed them with calm, measured words. He offered them food. The prisoners, initially stunned, stared at the officer in disbelief. Food, real food, after so long without it, after the long days of nothing but starvation and exhaustion. It seemed too good to be true. The officer, seeing their confusion, smiled gently and reassured them. He gestured for the soldiers to bring in the food. It was simple fare: bread, water, a few scraps of meat, but to the starving prisoners, it was a feast. The men hesitated, their instincts telling them to be wary, to not trust the enemy. But the hunger was overwhelming, and after a long, drawn-out moment of silence, they began to eat. At first, it was tentative, slow, as if they feared that any moment the kindness would be withdrawn, and they would once again be left to face their fate. But with each bite, the warmth began to return to their bodies, and the sharp pangs of hunger dulled. The food was sustenance, but it was also something more, a symbol of the unexpected humanity that had appeared in the midst of their suffering. The British soldiers, too, seemed to take no pleasure in their prisoners' discomfort. They watched as the men ate, their expressions solemn but not unkind. There was no malice in their eyes, only the weariness of soldiers who had seen too much, who understood the devastation of war. The prisoners, still in a daze, could not fully process the situation. They had expected to be treated like animals, to be abused, perhaps even executed. Yet, here they were, being offered food and care by the very people they had been taught to hate. The warmth of the gesture only served to deepen their confusion. What kind of enemy was this? What kind of war was this? For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The simple act of receiving food, of being treated with dignity after so long without it, was a moment of grace, a brief reprieve from the darkness of war. The prisoners, once so certain that they would face only cruelty, were now forced to confront a moral reversal that they could not comprehend. The enemy, in their eyes, had transformed from a faceless force of hatred to something more human, more complex. It was not a shift that could be easily understood, but it was a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As they ate, the men began to talk quietly among themselves. Their voices were hoarse, their words slow, as if they were unsure of what to say. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a shared sense of confusion and disbelief. The idea that their captors would treat them with kindness seemed unfathomable, yet it was happening before their eyes. The men had been trained to view the British soldiers as the enemy, to see them as an obstacle to be defeated at all costs. But now, in this moment of vulnerability, they were faced with a truth they had never expected. Their enemies were not so different from them. They, too, were human, and in this brief exchange, the walls of hatred that had been built between them began to crack. The food was more than just sustenance. It was a message. It was a message of compassion, of recognition of shared humanity, and it was a message that would change the course of these men's lives. The hunger they had felt for so long was no longer just physical. It was emotional, psychological. They had been starving for connection, for understanding, and in this moment, they found it in the unlikeliest of places. The irony was not lost on them. They had expected scorn, yet they had received warmth. They had expected cruelty, yet they had been shown kindness. The moral reversal was complete, and in that reversal, they found something they had thought was lost forever: hope. The prisoners had barely finished eating when they were escorted to a different part of the camp. The warmth of the food, though still present in their bodies, was now overshadowed by a growing sense of uncertainty. They had expected nothing but disdain from their captors, yet they had been met with kindness, kindness that felt out of place, almost surreal, in the midst of war. Their hunger had been quelled, but a deeper, more complex hunger began to take root, a hunger for understanding, for meaning in the absurdity of it all. As they were led through the camp, they tried to make sense of what had happened. The British soldiers, the enemy they had fought so fiercely against, had shown them no cruelty, no scorn, but instead treated them with what appeared to be genuine care. The men couldn't reconcile this new reality with the one they had been taught to believe in. In their minds, the British had always been the embodiment of everything they had been raised to despise: the enemy forces, the foreign invaders, the oppressors. The very idea that their captors might offer them warmth, kindness, and even empathy seemed impossible to grasp. How could this be? Was this some kind of trick? A ruse to break their spirits, to turn them into weak, compliant prisoners? Or was it something deeper, something more profound that they could not yet understand? The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances, their faces still gaunt, their eyes still clouded with the fog of war. They moved in silence, each one wrapped in his own thoughts, each one struggling to process what had happened. The camp, though not luxurious by any means, was different from the squalor they had come from. The men were given a place to sleep, however humble, and they were allowed to rest. The constant fear of death, of bombardments and surprise attacks, had subsided for the moment. But in its place was a new kind of unease, a question that lingered in the back of their minds. Why were they being treated this way? The men had spent years fighting a war that was not theirs to win. They had been caught in a conflict that had torn their world apart, and now, in the final days of that conflict, they were faced with the humbling reality of defeat. For so long, they had fought not just for survival, but for a cause they believed in. They had been taught that they were the defenders, the protectors of their land, their people, their way of life. But as the war drew to a close, those beliefs had been shattered. The cause they had fought for now seemed hollow, meaningless, and the sacrifices they had made felt futile. The prisoners, though physically broken, were still clinging to whatever fragments of identity they had left. They were soldiers, men who had fought and bled for their country. But now, in the hands of their captors, they felt like nothing more than shells of their former selves. They had lost their comrades, their homes, their dignity. And yet, here they were, receiving something they had never anticipated: compassion. This unexpected generosity rattled them to their core. They had been conditioned to expect nothing but disdain from their enemies, but instead, they were faced with the humanity of those they had tried to destroy. It was during this time of quiet reflection that the men began to observe the British soldiers around them more closely. These soldiers were not unlike them. They were men who had also seen the horrors of war, who had suffered losses of their own, who had watched their friends and comrades die in the same blood-soaked battlefields. They, too, carried the scars of war, both visible and invisible. The men had been so focused on their own suffering that they had failed to recognize the shared humanity between them and their captors. Now, as they watched the British soldiers going about their duties, caring for the wounded, tending to the prisoners, and offering simple comforts, they began to see a reflection of themselves in these men. The British soldiers, for their part, seemed to have a quiet understanding of what the prisoners were going through. They did not look at them with hatred or contempt. There were no sneers or mocking glances. Instead, there was something more, something that spoke to the shared burden of war. These soldiers, too, had been hardened by battle, but they had learned something in the process: that compassion, even in the darkest of times, was not a weakness. It was a strength. The British soldiers knew that their own survival depended on their ability to hold onto their humanity, to resist the dehumanizing effects of war. And so, they treated their prisoners with dignity, not out of pity, but out of a shared recognition of what war had taken from them all. As the days went by, the prisoners found themselves grappling with a complex mix of emotions. They had expected to be treated as less than human, to be marked by their defeat and their shame. But instead, they were being treated with respect. The simple acts of kindness, being offered food, being given a place to rest, being spoken to in a manner that acknowledged their humanity, began to change the way they saw their captors. The lines between enemy and ally started to blur, and the prisoners began to question the very nature of the conflict they had been part of. The hatred they had been taught to feel for the British soldiers now seemed absurd in the face of the kindness they were receiving. There was, of course, still a deep sense of shame among the prisoners. They could not escape the fact that they had been defeated, that they had failed in their mission, and that they were now at the mercy of the very men they had once sought to destroy. But the warmth they were being shown made it harder for them to hold on to that shame. The more they experienced the humanity of their captors, the more they began to let go of the hatred that had once fueled them. They began to see the British soldiers not as enemies, but as fellow human beings, caught in the same tragic, relentless tide of war. It was a shift in perspective that they could not have anticipated, and one that would alter their understanding of war, of suffering, and of what it meant to be human. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the prisoners were often gathered around a fire, sharing stories with the British soldiers. At first, the conversations were awkward, strained. There was an unspoken barrier between them, a fear that lingered in the air. But slowly, over time, that fear began to dissipate. The prisoners began to open up, talking about their lives before the war, about their families, their homes, their hopes for the future. The British soldiers did the same, revealing their own stories of life before the war, of the loved ones they had left behind, of the dreams they had once had. In these moments, there was no longer an enemy and a prisoner. There were just men, sharing a common humanity in the midst of chaos. For the prisoners, this experience was nothing short of transformative. They had expected scorn, but they had received understanding. They had expected cruelty, but they had been met with compassion. And in that compassion, they found a sense of peace, however fleeting, amidst the horror of war. The kindness shown to them by their captors was not just an act of mercy, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could still shine through. The men, once so certain of the inherent evil of their enemies, now found themselves questioning everything they had believed. They were no longer just soldiers at the mercy of their captors. They were human beings, struggling to make sense of a world torn apart by war, struggling to find some semblance of meaning in the face of unimaginable loss. And in that struggle, they had found something unexpected: hope. As the days stretched on, the prisoners found themselves in a state of profound confusion. What had begun as a momentary lapse in their expectations, a brief, surreal glimpse of compassion, was now beginning to unravel their understanding of the world they had known. They had anticipated being treated as subhuman, as enemies to be broken down and stripped of their dignity. Instead, they had been offered food, shelter, and an unexpected kindness. This stark contrast to everything they had been taught to expect was creating a deep sense of contradiction within them. They found themselves questioning not only the nature of their captors but also the very beliefs they had held about themselves, their country, and their place in the world. At first, the kindness felt like an anomaly. The food they had been given, the warmth of the British soldiers' demeanor, the simple acts of care, they seemed too good to be true. Surely this could not last. Perhaps it was some form of psychological manipulation, a tactic designed to break their spirits, to turn them into compliant prisoners who no longer thought for themselves. This suspicion was compounded by the men's own deep sense of shame. They had lost the war, and with it they had lost their honor, their pride, and their sense of purpose. They had been trained to see their enemies as brutal, unfeeling creatures, and now, in the face of the gentleness of their captors, they could not make sense of it. How could they reconcile the image of a merciless foe they had carried for so long with the human beings standing before them? The confusion deepened as the days passed, and the kindness from their captors showed no signs of abating. The British soldiers continued to treat them with respect, even care, offering them clean clothes, medical attention for their wounds, and more food than they had had in months. The men, once so steeped in the bitterness of war, now found themselves questioning everything they had believed. The acts of compassion they received were so foreign to their experience of war that they began to wonder if they were living in some kind of dream. Were they truly prisoners of war, or were they simply trapped in an alternate reality where the lines of good and evil had become blurred beyond recognition? There was also the matter of their own guilt. How could they, as soldiers, accept such kindness from their enemies without feeling as though they were betraying everything they had fought for? They had been taught that the British were the enemy, that they were the ones who would stop at nothing to destroy their homeland. And yet here they were, receiving kindness from the very people they had been taught to despise. They felt small, diminished in the face of such generosity. Their pride, once so rigid and unyielding, began to crumble under the weight of the moral dilemma they found themselves in. The more they received, the more their shame deepened. They could not reconcile the compassion of their captors with the hatred they had been taught to feel. In their minds, there was a clear, sharp division between the enemy and themselves. Now, however, that line had become blurred, distorted, and it left them in a state of moral disarray. Despite their growing discomfort, the prisoners found themselves opening up to the British soldiers in ways they never thought possible. They began to talk more freely, albeit cautiously, about their lives before the war. They spoke of their families, their homes, and the things they had lost. In these quiet exchanges, the men began to see that the British soldiers were not so different from themselves. They, too, had families they longed to return to, homes they missed, and lives they had put on hold in the name of war. Slowly, the walls of animosity that had separated them from their captors began to dissolve, replaced by a shared recognition of human vulnerability. These were not invincible enemies, as they had once believed, but men who had been torn apart by the same war that had torn them apart. They had been shaped by the same brutal forces, forced to fight in a conflict that had consumed everything in its path. And yet, despite all of it, there was still room for compassion, for understanding. There was still space for humanity. This realization was both unsettling and freeing. The prisoners had been so firmly entrenched in their beliefs that they had never allowed themselves to consider the possibility that their enemies were anything but monsters. And yet, here they were, seeing their captors as human beings with the same hopes, fears, and desires as themselves. The moral framework that had defined their worldview was crumbling, and in its place, a new understanding was beginning to take shape. But this new understanding did not come easily. It was fraught with internal conflict, with shame, guilt, and a sense of betrayal. To acknowledge the humanity of their captors meant acknowledging the possibility that the world they had once known, where the enemy was always cruel and unfeeling, was a lie. As the days wore on, the prisoners began to notice more subtle contradictions in the way they were treated. They were allowed to speak freely with the British soldiers, with no fear of reprisal. They were allowed to rest and recover without the constant threat of punishment hanging over them. They were not treated as criminals but as men who had been caught in the same storm of war, a storm that had swept them up and carried them to this point of defeat. It was almost as if the British soldiers were offering them not just food and shelter, but a kind of redemption, a chance to start over, to shed the bitterness and hatred they had carried with them for so long. But the prisoners could not fully accept this gift. They were still too mired in their own guilt, too entrenched in the belief that they had been wronged by their captors. They had been defeated, yes, but in their minds, the British were still the enemy, still the ones who had imposed this suffering on them. The notion that their captors might be offering them something more, something that transcended the bitterness of war, was a concept they were not yet ready to embrace. It was not just the prisoners who were conflicted. The British soldiers, too, seemed to be grappling with the reality of their role in this war. They, too, had been taught to see their enemies as less than human, to view them as objects to be destroyed in the name of victory. And yet, now that they were face to face with these men, their enemies, they could not help but see them as something more. The captors had no illusions about the nature of the war they were fighting. They knew that they had been part of a brutal, destructive conflict, one that had claimed the lives of millions and torn apart entire civilizations. But as they interacted with the prisoners, they began to understand that the war was not just a struggle between nations, it was a struggle between human beings, all of whom had been shaped by the same forces of violence, hatred, and fear. The British soldiers saw the same moral contradiction that the prisoners were struggling with. They had been raised to see their enemies as faceless, nameless figures, the embodiment of evil. But now, in the face of the defeated men, they saw something different. They saw men who had been caught in the same whirlwind of war, men who had suffered in ways they could not fully comprehend. And in this recognition, there was a certain humility, a recognition that they were not so different from their enemies, that the line between good and evil was not as clear-cut as they had once believed. The moral reversal that was taking place in the camp was not an easy one. It was a slow, uncomfortable process, filled with contradictions and moments of profound discomfort. But it was also a process of healing, of breaking down the walls that had been built between the men and their captors. It was a process of recognizing the shared humanity that existed between them, even in the darkest of times. And it was a process that would ultimately redefine their understanding of war, of suffering, and of what it meant to be human. The transformation within the camp continued as the days turned into weeks, and with it, the prisoners began to feel a shift in their perception of their situation. The contrast between their expectations and reality had grown even more pronounced. At first, the warmth they had been shown seemed like an anomaly, an isolated moment of mercy. But now, it was becoming a constant presence, an unanticipated thread woven into the fabric of their daily lives. The kindness and compassion they had received from the British soldiers was no longer a fleeting experience but a new reality they had to contend with. It was something they could not ignore, something they could not simply dismiss as a momentary lapse. And as it continued, it began to change the men in ways they had not anticipated. They were no longer just prisoners, weak and helpless, left to fend for themselves. The British soldiers had not only provided for their basic needs but had also given them a sense of security that they had not known in years. Their bodies, though still worn and weary, were slowly recovering from the physical toll of the war. The gnawing hunger that had plagued them for so long was being alleviated, and with each meal, they felt stronger, more grounded in the present. But it was not just their bodies that were being healed. Something more intangible, more elusive, was happening within them. The emotional and psychological scars of war, the constant fear and the ever-present sense of doom, were beginning to dissipate in the face of the unexpected kindness they were receiving. Despite the growing sense of comfort, there was still an undercurrent of unease among the prisoners. They had been trained to distrust their enemies, to see them as ruthless, heartless figures bent on their destruction. And yet, these same soldiers had shown them nothing but decency. The internal conflict that the prisoners faced was palpable. They could not fully accept the kindness they were being shown because it clashed with everything they had known. To accept this care meant acknowledging that their understanding of the world had been wrong, that their worldview, shaped by years of war and propaganda, was no longer valid. To accept that their captors could be compassionate was to face the uncomfortable truth that there were no clear lines between good and evil, no simple definitions of right and wrong. And that truth was more difficult to bear than the brutality they had once expected. As the prisoners recovered physically, their conversations with the British soldiers grew more frequent, and the lines between captor and captive began to blur. They talked about the war, about their experiences on the front lines, and about the lives they had left behind. In these conversations, the prisoners began to realize just how much they had in common with the men who had once been their enemies. The British soldiers, too, had families they missed, homes they longed to return to, and dreams that had been shattered by the war. They were not invulnerable figures, but men who had been shaped by the same brutal forces that had shaped the prisoners. Both sides had suffered, both sides had lost, and both sides had been changed by the war in ways that could not be undone. The more the prisoners engaged with their captors, the more they began to understand that the British soldiers were not the faceless, heartless entities they had imagined. They were, in fact, people who had been swept up in the same tragedy, who had seen their friends and comrades fall in battle, who had experienced the same emotional and physical exhaustion. The prisoners began to see the humanity in their captors, and with that recognition came a profound sense of discomfort. For the first time, they began to understand that the war was not a simple dichotomy of good versus evil, but a tragic and complex struggle in which all sides had lost something important. It was not just the prisoners who had been dehumanized by the war, it was everyone. The brutality of the conflict had stripped away the humanity of both sides, leaving behind only the remnants of men who were struggling to survive. The emotional complexity of the situation became more apparent as time went on. The prisoners, once so certain of their place in the world as soldiers, began to question their own actions. They had been taught to see the British soldiers as the enemy, to view them with hatred and distrust. And yet, here they were, receiving care from those same soldiers. It was a moral reversal that the men could not easily process. They had been raised to believe that war was a righteous cause, that their side was justified in its actions. But now, as they were shown kindness and compassion, they began to realize that there were no easy answers, no simple justifications. The world they had once understood so clearly had become murky, and the distinctions between right and wrong, friend and foe, were no longer as clear-cut as they had once seemed. It was in these moments of reflection that the prisoners began to understand the true cost of the war, not just the physical toll, but the emotional and psychological toll as well. The war had not only taken away their homes, their families, and their futures, but it had also stripped away their sense of identity. They were no longer simply soldiers, fighting for a cause they believed in. They were survivors, men who had endured the worst of what the world had to offer, and who now found themselves in a situation that defied all their expectations. The war had taken their dignity, but it had also taken their ability to see the humanity in others. The kindness shown to them by their captors was the first step in reclaiming that lost humanity, in beginning to rebuild the emotional and psychological pieces that had been shattered by years of conflict. As the days turned into weeks, the men began to form deeper connections with their captors. They began to realize that, despite everything that had happened, there was something more enduring than the animosity between them, something more powerful than the hatred they had been taught to feel. There was shared humanity. It was in the small moments of kindness, the quiet conversations around the fire, the simple acts of care, the understanding that passed between them without words, that the prisoners began to rebuild their sense of self. They had been shattered by the war, but they were beginning to heal. They were not alone. They were not just enemies. They were men who had been caught in the same storm, and together, they were beginning to find a way out of the wreckage. But this realization came with a heavy cost. The prisoners were still haunted by the ghosts of their past, the memories of battles fought, of comrades lost, of the faces of those they had killed. And now, as they saw the humanity in their captors, they were forced to confront the moral complexity of their own actions. How could they reconcile the warmth they were receiving with the things they had done in the name of war? How could they live with the knowledge that they had been part of a conflict that had torn so many lives apart? It was a question that lingered in their minds, unanswered, as they continued to grapple with the moral contradictions of their new reality. But despite the heaviness of these questions, there was a sense of renewal in the air. The prisoners had been given a second chance, not just at survival, but at understanding, at redemption. The kindness of their captors had opened their eyes to the possibility of reconciliation, of healing, and of finding peace in a world that had been shattered by war. The walls that had once divided them from their captors were slowly crumbling, and in their place, something new was beginning to emerge. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of a journey toward a shared humanity that transcended the boundaries of war. It was a journey that would take time, that would require the men to confront their pasts, but it was a journey that held the promise of healing, of redemption, and of a new understanding of what it meant to be human. As time passed, the prisoners, once bound by their role as enemies, began to form deeper connections with their captors. The lines between them had blurred so gradually that many of them, by the end, no longer saw a clear distinction between captor and captive. The empathy they were shown had altered their perceptions in profound ways. The initial shock, the confusion, and the guilt that had accompanied their surrender were still present but had softened, replaced by a new, unspoken understanding of shared humanity. Every passing day in the British camp seemed to peel back the layers of prejudice and hatred that had built up over years of brutal conflict. The guards who had once been nothing more than faceless enemies were now starting to resemble something more complex. Men who, just like them, had been caught up in the unrelenting horrors of war. The prisoners had begun to see that they were not so different from their captors. Both sides had faced unimaginable loss, witnessed carnage, and carried the emotional scars of a war that had stripped away any illusions of glory or honor. In conversations, whether quiet exchanges by the fire or over simple meals, it became clear that the British soldiers were not without their own burdens. The British men spoke of their experiences on the front lines, of the friends they had lost, and of the exhaustion that came with fighting a war that seemed endless. They too had seen their comrades die, and in those moments of mutual recognition, there was a deep, almost wordless bond that began to form. The soldiers, once the embodiment of the enemy, were now simply people who had experienced war in the same way, in ways that could never be fully understood by those who had not endured it. For the prisoners, the psychological shift was just as profound. They had entered the camp expecting to be treated as little more than animals, starved, beaten, and dehumanized. But that dehumanization had not come. Instead, the British soldiers had given them a glimpse of a world beyond the endless cycle of violence. They were not just prisoners but men who could still feel, still hope, and still find a way forward. The kindness they had experienced started to make them question the moral framework that had once been so rigid. It was easy to see things in black and white when one was in the middle of battle, when the fog of war clouded every decision. But now, sitting in the quiet of the camp, the complexities of war and human nature began to become more apparent. The British soldiers did not treat them as a faceless enemy but as individuals. Each prisoner, once seen as a mere cog in a machine of destruction, was now recognized as a person with his own life, his own pain, and his own history. This transformation in how they were treated made it harder for the prisoners to cling to the hatred they had once carried. To hate their captors now would mean rejecting the warmth and care they had been shown, and that was not easy. Each kindness, no matter how small, began to chip away at the walls of animosity they had built. The food they were given, the warm clothes, the gentle voices, they were reminders that, even in the darkest moments of human history, there could be acts of profound decency. In the midst of this, The prisoners began to confront a new challenge. How could they reconcile their feelings of gratitude and humanity toward their captors with the immense guilt they felt for the things they had done during the war? They had been soldiers, fighting for a cause they believed in, fighting to protect their country, to uphold their honor.